Yo, the name's Alpern, and today I will be sharing my knowledge from playing a few hundred hours or so across the MoW2 playtests the past year, as well as having a bit of an early access to a review version of the game. With MoW2 releasing in just a couple hours, I hope that this video will smooth out the learning curve a bit so that you can hop into PvP without feeling at a massive disadvantage, if you're like me and have never played this franchise before. First things first, I would like to explain the basics of camouflage and vision, as these are extremely important fundamentals as well as working differently from other common RTS games. If you've played War Thunder or World of Tanks, this should be quite familiar. Units do have a vision range, however, enemy units within that vision range can remain unspotted. Now this depends on something such as a camo rating, whereas you would expect making sounds such as shooting or running will lower that camo rating, thus increasing the chance of you getting spotted. Meanwhile, if you go prone with infantry and hide them, for instance in bushes or vegetation, and thus lowers the chance of being revealed. Certain units with the stealth ability helps you learn this system quite intuitively, as there will be visual ready indicators of enemies' real line of sight. Example Grazia, you will be revealed by entering that area. When running, you can see that area increase larger, thus showing how you're easier spotted when running. Stealth units are extremely powerful, as they generally also don't capture territory, meaning they can get deep within enemy lines and reveal soft targets for artillery or airstrikes, but only if an enemy doesn't pay attention. This is due to how spotted units get a red eye icon next to their card, which, if it happens deep within friendly territory without units being engaged in combat, most likely means that there are enemy stealth units revealing your positions. Now this can be countered by units with improved stealth detection abilities, such as Pathfinders or Jaegers. While I'm already at it, let's also explain the other common vision icons. The red bulb means you've recently been spotted and your position is marked approximately for enemies with small flashes in the fog of war. A green bulb means your unit is now completely undetected and eventually gets replaced by no icon, which simultaneously also means that you're currently not detected. Pretty much every single unit also has a much larger firing range than their vision range, and this even includes infantry, so it's a really good idea to always have some sort of a scouting unit. This doesn't necessarily have to be a dedicated scouting unit by any means, just any infantry in general works quite well. What I've learned to sort of do intuitively is to use CQC units with SMGs as scouts, as they do better closer to the action while scouting for your long-range infantry, such as infantry with rifles or light machine guns. All you have to do is really to remember to keep a low profile with your scouting infantry, quite literally by having them crawl, but also by forcing hold fire. Hotkeys for these are extremely valuable in MoW2, so I suggest that you learn them. Defaults are space to stop and go crawl with infantry, and Shift T to hold fire. This does however not only apply to infantry, but I've personally found that artillery regiments use scouting mechanics the most, as there is often minigames between opposing artillery players that are good with constant shoot and move tactics. Since shooting will mostly reveal your position with strong artillery, you often become a target for counter-artillery, and by moving you limit the chance of getting hit. This generally makes self-propelled artillery a lot better, but good players even use towing mechanics to quickly reposition after firing a barrage. For units with massive reloads, such as a Katyusha, Calliope or Sturmtiger, it's also very common for players to completely retreat these units after use, as they eat up your command points while reloading on the field, as well as being vulnerable targets. Eating command points is quite bad, as not only can you field less units, but having higher command points means your logistics timer gets longer. For tanks, it can be extremely useful to try to bait flanks with your tank destroyers, as these are often a bit fragile but extremely deadly given that they have a good position and can get their first shots off reliably. Thus, holding fire on tank destroyers and using direct control on these once an opportunity arises is highly recommended. Direct control is extremely good in general, and the default hotkey for it is E. This is good versus infantry or support weapons, and very useful for artillery when you want to hit the juiciest AoE shots in the middle of a blob. But for vehicles, I found it to be even better to have a dedicated hotkey for the first person mode, which actually doesn't have a keybind by default. I therefore highly recommend you to add a keybind for this, as it makes your tank micro extremely efficient. Personally, I've enjoyed having it binded to a special mouse key. Another good hotkey for vehicles is also space, which similarly to infantry holds your tanks. Unfortunately, for some reason, the space hotkey doesn't stop half tracks, which is a thing to keep in mind. Another incredible hotkey is B followed by a left click. This allows your selected units to ungarrison, anything from an actual garrison to dropping support weapons or even leaving tanks. Shift B drops off only passengers, such as infantry riding tanks or infantry that are only getting transported by half tracks and not manning any of the guns. While also on the topic of vehicles, having a vehicle selected, you can actually switch shells by pressing Q. There's quite an extensive amount of shell types in MoW2, which if you're unfamiliar with the terminology can be a bit overwhelming. Generally speaking, AP means armor piercing, thus anti-tank, while HE means high explosive, which makes it mainly anti-infantry, and HEAT means high explosive anti-tank, which is like a superior version to armor piercing. There are also shell types such as white phosphorus, commonly called Willy Pete, that doubles as a smoke and a fire shell. These can work quite well even versus vehicles, as you can burn the crew members, though be aware that smoke impacts not only your vision but also makes units highly inaccurate. While aiming in the first person mode, your crosshair also changes color depending on your chance of penetrating armor. For instance, if you have very low to no chance at all to penetrate, the crosshair will be red. Meanwhile, if you have a decent chance at penetrating, it will be yellow, and if you have a very good chance of penetrating, it will turn green. Using hotkeys for things such as grenades is also very useful, however you often can make do without it. Units will mostly automatically throw grenades once there is enemies nearby that they don't have a clear line of sight of. This is also true for things such as anti-tank grenades, so if you right-click a vehicle with your infantry and they have access to any anti-tank weaponry such as Zooks or anti-tank grenades, they will favor using these above their rifles, so it's not really necessary to use the hotkeys for these. Speaking of right-click, while a right-click command does move a unit to the clicked position, right-clicking twice will force the unit to take a quote-unquote faster direct route, which means that they will trigger sprint abilities for infantry, or for vehicles, crash everything in its path even though there is a perfectly fine road nearby. Moving on with hotkeys. The hotkey to check your inventory for your selected unit is I, and remember that vehicles also have their own separate inventory from crew members crewing the vehicle. Vehicle inventory often contain fuel cans, which you can use to refuel your vehicles by dragging the can out of the inventory onto the ground, then picking it up with a crew member to refuel. To transfer inventory from one to another, while having a unit selected, use the hotkey X, followed by clicking on a target. That way you can transfer inventory equipment from fallen soldiers or from vehicles or crates. By holding down the hotkey C, you reveal everything that you can interact with, including such crates or vehicle inventories, as well as highlighting bodies to scavenge. Now remember that mostly in PvP, supply will be done by simply staying within the area of resupply units, so it's arguable really how useful these hotkeys are, but I still think they're worth knowing about. Now let's talk a bit about regiments and their special abilities. Having a regiment with access to engineers will allow you to use fortifications without calling in infantry. Instead, while having nothing selected, available fortifications will appear that when used will be built passively by your engineers. These engineers will not use up any of your pop cap, but will return and make construction available again as soon as they are finished. You can, however, still cancel this by forcing retreats, simply by selecting the engineers and double-clicking the F key. Combat engineers work similarly, though they lay mines instead of making fortifications. Medics allows you to right-click any dying infantry, which means a medic will go and pick up that infantry, and after some time these can be called back into action. Some unique regiments, such as the Engineer Regiment, can even use their medics on teammates' infantry. Airstrikes are extremely versatile versus all targets, though depending on the aircraft used, you can specialize by switching the ammunition used to things that can be a bit more effective. Compared to games such as Company of Heroes, you can also switch targets mid-flight by selecting the plane and assigning a new order. If enemy anti-air gets revealed, for instance, you can also double tap F to force a plane to retreat early, maybe saving its life. Downing planes is critical to countering them, so keeping them alive is very important, as they can be used infinitely until they are shot down. For air regiments, this means that you generally want to target and destroy enemy anti-air positions as quickly as possible. Vice versa, if you are facing air regiments, keep that anti-air highly defended by keeping it mobile and supported at all times. Now, while I am not that strong of a player in Men of War, I've noticed that certain regiments are also massive game changers, and these generally are the airborne regiments, as they have such a massive impact if they're not dealt with. Other regiments that have extreme potentials are specifically the 5th medium tank regiments for all three factions, as these can field higher class mediums already in Echelon 1, such as T-34s, M4A1 Shermans or Panzer IV F2s. Any of these regiments you generally feel invincible during the entire duration of Echelon 1, and you can make extreme pushes early, which you can then fortify to defend throughout the rest of the match. Main counters to these are really only the anti-tank regiments, as they can field early Marders, Su-76 or T-48 casemate tank destroyers to repel those tanks. If none of those are fielded, you're quite reliant on just overwhelming or outright just trying to stall to Echelon 2. And this has been a bit of a short entry guide to PvP for Men of War 2, releasing in a few hours. Thanks for watching.